Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at how to assemble the 3D printed thin section viewer part of the Viewing the Rock World project. I have in front of me here all the necessary 3D printed parts and tools that you'll need in order to build the viewer. Let's start by briefly going over the 3D printed parts, the files for which are available on the website. The parts are all laid out in front of me. We have a turn gear, a main drive gear, which gets mounted on the main drive bracket. We have two identical follow gears, which are mounted on the follow brackets. We have a central follow gear and two identical follow gear brackets. We have two support posts, two link posts, two 4mm grub screws, two polarizer rings, and the most important parts, the ring gears responsible for turning the polarizers. In terms of the tools, we'll need a 4mm hex wrench, some type of glue, in this case I'm using super glue, a marker, a pair of scissors, a drill or a driver. We need a 1/4" hex bit, in my case I'm using a number 2 Phillips, and two 3D printed tools, the first of which is a gear with a hole for that 1/4" hex bit and a template to cut out the polarizer. We'll also need a lubricant. I'm using a petroleum-based bearing grease, but you can also use Vaseline, which works quite well. And finally, we'll also need a linear polarizing film from which we'll cut out our polarizers. Let's begin. These parts are all essentially straight off of the 3D printer. I've cleaned them up a little bit, removed any excess plastic and any support material, but we're still going to need to work on them a little bit before we can assemble them. The first step is to prepare the ring gears. Now these ring gears are designed to print in place. That means that you can take them right off the printer bed and they should rotate. The inner and outer parts should rotate relative to each other. But you'll see that when you start turning them immediately after printing, they can be a little rough, there can be quite a little bit of friction. And so the first step is to wear these in. And that process simply involves turning this gear, the inner gear, many times to wear out any asperities that might be getting in the way and causing excess friction. So you can do this simply by hand, by turning it several hundreds or even thousands of times. A pretty easy way to do this, though, is to use your drill or your driver and this 3D printed gear with a hex hole, and you insert your hex bit into it. And now you can mount your gear onto your drill. And what you'll do now is simply turn the gear with the drill over and over again to really wear it in. And once you notice that the friction is kind of stabilized and things have smoothed out, then we can move on to the next step. So we'll do that for both of the gears here. And we're looking at maybe 4 or 5 minutes for each gear. So once you feel that the resistance to turning of the gears has sort of stabilized, we'll move on to the next step, which is lubrication. So you'll notice that each of these ring gears has a threaded hole on the top. And what we'll do here is fill those threaded holes with grease. That's going to allow us to port grease directly into the space between the outer and inner gear in order to lubricate it. So the first step is to fill the threaded hole of both of these ring gears with grease. Once both of the threaded holes are filled, you'll next take your hex wrench and one of those grub screws, mount it onto your hex wrench, and begin turning it in to one of those threaded holes, stopping just when it starts to engage with the thread. Once you've started to screw it in, you'll then begin to turn that inner ring gear by hand, turn the screw a few more turns, turn the ring gear, and repeat that process. What this is doing is driving the grease from within this port into that inner gear, and then we're distributing it by turning it around. So continue this process until that grub screw is flush with the top of both of your polarizer ring gear bodies. Now that both of the ring gears have had their lubricant delivered to the inner portion of the gear, we're going to further distribute it using our drill or driver. And this won't take nearly as much as the wear-in period. We just want to turn it maybe a few dozen times in order to really distribute that grease around. So repeat this for both of these ring gears. Now that the ring gears are moving nice and smoothly and are properly lubricated, we can move on to the next steps of assembly. So we'll start by taking our main drive bracket. This is the bracket that's going to hold the main gear that drives the polarizer rings, the main drive gear, as well as the turn gear that you're going to physically turn in order to turn the polarizers on the slide viewer. Now with every gear that we're going to install, we're going to lubricate the shafts on which that gear is going to rest. So in this case, this central vertical post is going to house our main drive gear. And so we'll just apply a tiny bit of lubricant to that shaft. We don't want to overdo things and have the lubricant kind of ooze out, just enough to smooth things out as it turns. Next, we'll do the same with the turn gear. Now, the turn gear is quite critical in that it is the only gear that once you install, you will not be able to remove. So be certain that you're ready to install it when you do. The turn gear goes onto this post with the 2 wing clips. We'll apply a little bit of lubrication as well. It should clip in place, and once installed, it will not come off. So with the main drive gear assembly complete, we'll move on to the follow gears. So we have the 2 follow brackets. These are identical, and the 2 identical follow gears. We'll lubricate that central post for both of these in a similar manner as the main drive gear, and install the follow gears. Once both of the follow gears are installed on the follow brackets, we're going to take the little linking posts and insert them into the holes on the underside of the follow brackets. Now these should push into place, clip into place. Once you've pushed in these linking posts, the 2 parts should come together without any need for any adhesive or glue, and just sort of clip together. There we go. We now have part of the follow gear assembly. The next step is going to be to repeat a very similar process with the central follow gear. So the central follow gear gets mounted on these central follow gear holders. So we'll lubricate the central post for both of these. Now you can go ahead and place that central follow gear on one of the 2 central follow gear holders. The next step, we're going to take this central follow gear and its holder and you'll slip the two holes of the central follow gear holder over the posts of this follow gear assembly. Now you want to make sure that when you do this, the side of the central follow gear that has that little bump, or the follow gear holder, sorry, that has this little bump, is pointed towards these follow gears. And so you slip this on like so, and push to slide that down these two posts. Once you've done this, you'll take your remaining central follow gear holder and you'll repeat that process, sliding it over, lining it up with the central follow gear. So now the central follow gear is captive between these two holders. Once you've done this, turning one of the gears on the follow gear assembly, which is now complete, should turn all of the gears synchronously. Now this is complete, we can begin assembling the entire viewer. So we'll start by taking one of our ring gears, and we'll take the drive gear assembly, the main drive gear assembly, and the upright posts of the main drive gear assembly go into the corresponding holes on the side opposite to the handle on the ring gear. So we'll just simply insert into there, making sure that the gear is lined up with the teeth on the inner ring gear and clipping it together. At this point, turning the turn gear should turn that inner portion of the ring gear. We'll now repeat a similar process with our follow gear assembly, taking these two posts and lining up to the two corresponding holes on the handle side of the ring gear. Once again, taking care to line up that follow gear with that inner gear. Once it's lined up, you should be able to push. Now turning the main turn gear should not only turn the inner gear, but also the entire follow gear assembly. Next, we'll take the two support posts and insert them into the two holes under the main drive gear assembly. Next, we'll take the opposing ring gear and mount it on, lining up the holes on the underside to the posts that stick out on the bottom. Taking care to make sure to line up the teeth of the follow gear to the inside teeth of that ring gear. Once everything's aligned, it should all click into place. At this point, turning the main drive gear should turn the entire assembly at once. The slide viewer is now nearly complete, and all that remains is to install the linear polarizers. To do this, we'll get our linear polarizer film and the polarizer ring template, and now all you need to do is trace out two circles on your polarizing film and cut those polarizer filters out. We now have the two linear polarizing filters. If your filters come with a protective plastic, at this point you'll want to remove it, as it may interfere, depending on the order of the polarizers, with the polarization. So in my case they do, and so I will peel that off. So the two plastic films have been removed from the polarizers. We're now going to take our slide viewer assembly and drop in the first polarizer right into place. And then using a tiny bit of glue, we're just going to tack it in a few places around that top ring. trying to use as little as glue as possible. Once that's done, you'll take one of the polarizing rings and drop it into place, and it should sort of click into place, and along with the glue will hold that polarizing filter firmly. We'll now repeat that process on the other side. Now that's done, the final step of the assembly is to align the two polarizers. Now, depending on the orientation that they have relative to each other, you may see some amount of light passing through, but with cross polars, we should see essentially no light coming through our slide viewer. For more details on this, see other parts of the documentation. So in order to do this, we're going to disassemble the slide viewer ever so slightly, pulling off one of the ring gears far enough that the gears are no longer making contact with the inner ring gear. And then looking through the slide viewer, rotate it until it goes completely dark. Once it goes dark, reassemble it while maintaining that orientation and taking care to realign those gears as you press it together. The thin section viewer is now complete, and all that remains is to insert a thin section in its holder. For more information about the thin sections and their holders, see the documentation. Enjoy the mesmerizing kaleidoscope of colors that viewing the rock world offers.